minute or two before we get there, but the first passage we'll be in is Matthew chapter 20, verses 29 through 34. But I thought the teacher book did a good job of summarizing kind of some of the history of Jericho. So I'm just going to read that to kind of orient us this morning. By most accounts, Jericho is one of the oldest cities. Archaeologists agree that the site has been almost continuously inhabited from prehistoric times. It is little wonder that the city and its environs are one of the most excavated places on Earth. Its defenses include deserts and mountains that nearly engulfed it. Copious springs give it ready access to water for drinking and agriculture. Despite its proximity to many springs, Jericho has a dry climate. Then it goes on to talk about Jerusalem is approximately 2,700 feet above sea level. Jericho is about 8,400 feet below sea level. Jericho also had a rich history. It was a coveted location by leaders throughout history. The first of the Herods, Herod the Great, built Jericho as one of the central cities and spent much time in his palace there. And also, the Dead Sea Scrolls that most of us are probably familiar with were discovered in caves just south of the ancient city. So there's a lot of historical context here, more than some of the other cities that we've talked about. Kind of to see where it is, we've got Jericho there, kind of oriented to Jerusalem. To the northeast. So that's a little bit about the city that we'll be studying today. So anyway, if you'd like to, if you haven't had a chance to yet, turn over to Matthew chapter 20, verses 29 through 34. That's where we'll get started this morning. Now, as they went out of Jericho, a great multitude followed him. And behold, two blind men sitting by the road, when they heard that Jesus was passing by, cried out, saying, "Have mercy on us, O Lord, Son of David." Then the multitude warned them that they should be quiet, but they cried out all the more, saying, "Have mercy on us, O Lord, Son of David." So Jesus stood still and called them and said, "What do you want me to do for you?" They said to him, "Lord, that our eyes may be opened." So Jesus had compassion and touched their eyes, and immediately their eyes received sight, and they followed him. So the first passage that we're looking at here is about these two blind men who call out to Jesus and are healed. And I think one of the interesting things about this as it happens is that you have these two blind men who are still able to recognize who Jesus is that they're walking along the road here, right? So they heard Jesus talking, as it says here in verse 30, or they heard that Jesus was passing by, so someone must have mentioned it to them, or they, sometimes if people know someone and they like maybe see a celebrity or you see somebody out shopping, people will be kind of talking about it. There was even a time when me and Shelby were in London once where we were doing a tour and everybody was like, "Oh, the king's out walking around." And so I went over and looked. She still doesn't believe that I actually saw the king because she thought I was joking about it. But anyway, the way I picked up on that was because people were like whispering around about it. So there's different ways that people, even without being able to see themselves, might know that someone of prominence or someone that people know are passing by. But we have these two blind men that do notice Jesus, or know that he's coming by. One of the things I did want to mention as we get started here, though, is based on like kind of when this happens and what we know is coming. We're getting closer and closer, and we're almost to this point in our study in a couple weeks too, starting to look at Jesus as he prepares, to be sacrificed for us for the crucifixion, all of that. But we also know from what we know about Jesus that he knows this is coming, right? We know that it's heavy on his mind that this is ultimately what's going to need to happen, and he's willing to do it. But I think that's important context for us to remember as we see him, even in this short passage, stopping to heal these two blind men, right? Like, I know if I had something that was weighing on me, not even, like I've stressed out about way smaller things than like what Jesus is about to go through, and my ability to still focus on and take care of other people instead of like brushing them off, I'm not very good at that. And so I think that's something else to appreciate about what Jesus does here as we study through this. I guess So we also see in verse 31, the multitude warned them that they should be quiet. What are some reasons that the crowd or the people around them, the multitude as we have here, would tell these two blind men to be quiet? Okay, they didn't want to cause a commotion or uproar. What do we know or about like people who had disabilities like this historically? Like what kind of class were they in society? Typically speaking, they were lower, right? Most of the time, it's still very hard if you're blind or have certain disabilities even today to be able to do certain tasks in society and things like that. But I feel like in that regard, from this time, we've come a long way as far as like the different things we've done for accessibility to help people out. But back then, like, if you were blind or you couldn't, like when we talked about the paralytic man, you couldn't move or had some disability like that, it was very hard to make a living. It was very hard for you, you generally needed people to help you, to take care of you. So also, people might have been fighting them because they were looked down upon, right? Like, how could you be somebody who thinks you can just call out to Jesus like this, depending on who the multitudes were as well. And I think that just goes to show, if that was the case, also like Jesus's compassion here, we know that he tended to focus on people who were of a lesser status, as we've studied throughout the past weeks. So this is just another example of him showing compassion no matter what the scenario. And then we see after verse 31 that Jesus stands still and calls out to them, "What do you want me to do for you?" And this again is one of those instances where it's like interesting for us to think about how Jesus is conversational here, right? Like he knows ultimately what they're thinking, what they're going to ask of him, but he has a conversation with them about what they want to be done, and that ultimately so they can tell him, and so that they have a conversation about it. And I think this parallels, when we think about even like our prayer life today, right? Like he created us, he knows what we need, he knows all the things about us, but we still, have the back and forth through his word to us and the ability to pray to him. And I think that is important in a lot of cases, right? It would have been, it would have potentially played out differently if Jesus had just, as he would see people who were in distress, he might see these blind people, not have a conversation with them and just heal them in passing, right? Like he could have just said, everyone that, is anywhere around me, I heal or I take care of, and that's how people know that I've passed by. But that's not what we see happening here, right? Like he has a conversation with them and does expect them to tell him what they're looking for. And I think that's, interesting as well, that he has that direct question. And then, they ultimately say to him, "Lord, that our eyes may be opened." And so they tell him what they want from him, and then he has compassion on them, touches their eyes, and immediately their eyes receive sight, and they follow him. So we see, another like direct ask from them, and I think we've seen this a lot as we've studied through different accounts of people talking to Jesus, where if they truly believe that he's able to do what the miraculous things that he's doing, there isn't some back and forth like we've seen from some other characters, even in the Old Testament, of like kind of like, prove this to me or whatever. They just know he's got these abilities, so I'm going to ask of him to do a certain miraculous thing, and then they expect, because of their faith, that that thing is going to be done. And that's how we should build our faith today, right? Like we should know, from what we've studied in God's word, from what we've seen throughout our lives, that we have evidence that God and Jesus will take care of us and do what they promised us. And so we have faith, and that changes our lives and how we do things and how we act as Christians. So I think that's another reminder and great example for us. And I think also, as far as like, even as I mentioned with like prayer, parallels to prayer and how we talk to God, I think sometimes it is good for us to be like direct with what we're asking for, right? Sometimes I feel like we can maybe, whether it's public prayer or in our own lives, maybe we come up with something that's like, this is the standard prayer that we say, or these are the standard things that we say in a prayer. And like, that's not bad, but sometimes or I think regularly we need to be thinking about, especially in our personal prayer life, like, are we asking for specific things that we need to, be better Christians or be better family members or whatever the case may be, just like these men did here of Jesus. So I think those are some things that stood out to me. And then, in verse 34, it sums up about the Jesus having compassion, touching their eyes, and immediately they received their sight. And I think this just echoes all the miracles that we've looked at before, right? This wasn't a case where Jesus did something and then they started to be able to see really blurry. And then, it took days, like as we talked about with some medical procedures for the other miracles we've looked at, right? Like a lot of times if you have like surgery on your eyes or cataract surgery or different things, you need to wear certain sunglasses for a certain amount of time afterwards. You need time for your eyes to heal before they're even back to some semblance of normalcy of what they were before. But as we know with like Jesus's miracles, because of the power he had and the authority he had, these two men were ultimately healed, received their sight, and they followed him. So I think that's important for us to remember just the power that Jesus had and the authority that they had. And then ultimately they follow him because they're acting on, what happened to them. So anyway, that's a fairly short passage, but I think there's a lot of powerful things there. Any other thoughts that come to mind as we work through that? Yeah.
Well, looking at the crowd that followed him, a lot of them just followed him just because they were hoping that he might do something for them, and that, or, it tells us later on that the lady who just touched his garment was healed and things like that. But these gentlemen asked specifically of him. I mean, they had heard of him and they heard of the miracles that he had performed. So they really they asked specifically, and I think like you said in our prayers, that we do need to be specific at times as to what we really want. Like if I have an issue that continuously bothers me and things like that, instead of just saying, well, God help me, be a better or whatever, it needs to be more specific as to what that issue is, so that God, even though he knows, then I know that this is specific to what I asked about, and things like that.
Yeah, and I think that's good for us to like just keep in our mind, not the forefront of our mind of like every shortcoming that we have or everything that's going on all the time, but like I think it's really good. Like I find myself falling into the trap sometimes of where I'm way too general in my prayers of like, not thinking of like specific things. And I think that like part of, at least in my mind, the reason that works the way it does, where God doesn't just read our minds but expects us to pray about things, is because when we're thinking about things and either wanting to make a change, if it's a sin that we're trying to stop, or if we're wanting to change something in our lives, a lot of times we got to be a part of that process too. It's not that God couldn't do it without us, but it does take us. And so sometimes just like verbalizing those words and like saying them helps us to be more in the zone for like being able to work through the problem with God's help, or work through whatever situation that we might find ourselves in. So that's good. Yeah, Pax.
Just a few quick things if I can remember them all. I was thinking about the eye thing. Today when they do surgery on eyes, don't they often do one at a time? Like do one. Like if somebody's lasering my eyeballs, I don't know if I want both.
Yeah.
In case there's an oops moment, so let me, have a few weeks to recover. Then I was also thinking what you were saying about these guys. Like when we have a big politician come to town or some famous person, often the city will try to clean up certain areas, like move some people off some street corners. And I think maybe the people of Jericho were thinking of these guys as an embarrassment to their city.
Yeah.
And they had this popular young teacher come into town, and they no, we don't want to be known for that. And then the other thing Lord have mercy on us, son of David, which I find interesting being in Matthew's account. Matthew is establishing Jesus as the king.
Mm.
And that was a big thing in chapter 1 with the genealogy. And I think it's interesting, Matthew throws that in there, that Jesus is, in fact, the descendant of David. He's in line to be the king, and he's qualified, and even the blind guys know it.
Yeah, and I think something that I didn't mention was that, probably they were Jewish, having known this in the area that they were in, and would have, that's why, they would have referred to Jesus this way as well. Any other, do you have anything?
They would have had to have a pretty fair amount of faith
Mhm.
to hear him. They've never seen any of his miracles. We don't know if they've been involved or around him, or they'd only really heard about him. But they had to have enough faith and conviction in that faith to ask him to heal us and believe that he would.
Right. And I think as you were saying that made me think, like a lot of times we might find ourselves today saying like, oh, I would have such stronger faith if I could be there to see these things, or if I, was able to witness this, or, there might be people who don't come to church or who don't believe in Jesus and God. And they were like, if I could just see these things, but you even had them there at the time when other people were able to see things and they were only able to hear it, they couldn't read things people had written, and they, would have had similar access to what we have today. I guess they would have been hearing first or second hand accounts, but still to like put everything together and have the faith that they do is impressive. And just I think goes to show also that like we are all able to consume information in different ways and take it in, some based on the abilities that we have, whether it's visual or audio or whatever ways that we might take it in. But if we process the information correctly, we should come to the same outcome. Any other thoughts before we move on to the next passage? All right. Next, we're going to be going to Luke chapter 19, verses 1 through 10. Luke chapter 19, verses 1 through 10. I will spare you all singing about Zacchaeus up here, but Luke 19, 1 through 10. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through, and there was a man called by the name of Zacchaeus, and he was a chief tax collector, and he was rich. Zacchaeus was trying to see who Jesus was, and he was unable due to the crowd, because he was short in stature. So he ran on ahead and climbed up a sycamore tree in order to see him, because he was about to pass through that way. And when Jesus came to the place, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for today I must stay at your house. And he hurried and came down and received him joyfully. When the people saw this, they all began to complain, saying, he has gone in to be the guest of a man who is a sinner. But Zacchaeus stopped and said to the Lord, behold, Lord, half of my possessions I am giving to the poor, and if I have extorted anything from anyone, I am giving back 4 times as much. And Jesus said to him, today salvation has come to this house, because he too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man has come to seek and to save that which was lost. So a lot of us are probably familiar with the story of Zacchaeus from earlier on in our lives. But, verse 1 talks about Jesus entering Jericho as he was passing through. So we have reference to the city of Jericho, which is why we're studying it today. And then we have our first mention of Zacchaeus. So he was a chief tax collector, and just as quick review of what that typically meant in these times was that even Jewish people could be tax collectors, and how that typically worked was they would bid for these positions. So it wasn't necessarily like accountants or IRS agents that we might be familiar with, where here's the amount of tax you owe and you work with these people and you pay them. Instead, they would bid for these positions, and they could basically collect what they could get out of people and keep the extra. So they were responsible for a certain amount, and then any they could get above and beyond they could keep. So as you can imagine, people would bid for these powerful positions and try to make more money off of people. So we don't even like paying taxes today. If you could imagine having to deal with that back then, people really wouldn't have liked them. But we see here that Zacchaeus was a chief tax collector, so he's likely over other tax collectors, and if following that practice, skimming off the top. Here what I read even said he was a chief tax collector and he was rich, and so if you put all that together, it's very likely that he was doing some of or all of the things that we would expect a tax collector to be doing in this time, and so people didn't really like tax collectors because of this, and so that's the position that he finds himself in. So that sets the stage there. I think another thing this is not super deep into the biblical side of things, but I was curious as I was studying, like how short was Zacchaeus? We are not told, other than he couldn't see it for people around him. From what I looked at in the region at the time, the average male height based on like skeletal studies and things like that was 5'3" to 5'5" for men, and so women would have been a little bit shorter. So if we assume where Zacchaeus would have been if he couldn't see, he's probably around like 5 feet tall. I just thought that was a question that came to mind, so I did a little bit digging there. That's not written anywhere, so but just for us to understand, I think we've all dealt with this concept though of where either as a child growing up or just not being able to see because somebody's in front of you and you try to like shift around to see, or maybe you climb up on something or whatever. I don't know that I can ever remember climbing a tree to do this, but I'm not like a good climber or anything, so but I've definitely like stood on things to be able to see things that I want to see, or like stood on my toes or whatever. Also, another interesting thing is like if you think of him as this wealthy official, this chief tax collector, this is probably a little bit of a comical scene to see somebody that you would think of prominence like running to climb a tree to be able to see somebody else. So I think that's interesting. And then I kind of looked at what the actual tree, it talks about it being a sycamore tree, and I think that from what I looked at on pictures, those tend to have lower, thicker branches, so hopefully it would have been a little bit easier for him to get up on. But I don't know a lot about trees, but I was trying to understand how he would have been able to like do all of this, or maybe if they were just more used to climbing trees back then or whatever, because I would guess, at least I don't know how many people in this room would feel like they could go out there and climb one of the trees to be able to see somebody coming around. So anyway, that was some interesting stuff as I dug in. But then as we get into the text more, Zacchaeus was trying to see who Jesus was. So I think we can assume that he had heard of Jesus and was interested in seeing this. I don't think Zacchaeus would have done this just to be like, oh, there's a crowd of people, I need to see who this is, because of all the things I described. It's a somewhat difficult task that he performs to be able to see Jesus. So he runs ahead, climbs up the sycamore tree in order to see him, because he knew he was about to pass that way. And so I think we can, even in that part, just see some interesting things about the like effort that Zacchaeus goes through to see Jesus, and the same effort that we hopefully put forth in our lives because we know who Jesus is, to spend time in his word and to, try to emulate him and be like him. We can see some parallels there. So he climbs up the sycamore tree, and when Jesus came to the place, he looked up to him and said, Zacchaeus, hurry and come down, for today I must stay at your house. And so Jesus says this. I thought this was interesting how this was worded. Why do you all think that Jesus says to Zacchaeus, today I must stay at your house? Again, we don't always know all of the conversations that were happening. We might not all have been recorded, exactly what words they said, but why would have he said, for today I must stay at your house? Yeah.
Because I think he knew what the people were going to say. You're going to be with sinners. And, they're saying they're not sinners. I think maybe he was doing that so he could show that he was for all people.
Right. I think this ties in well with what we discussed in some of the past weeks of like, Jesus is here for a mission. His mission is not to come and talk to the, people that different people in society look at as the ones to look up to, right? They, like Jesus is here to seek and save the lost. And so, he's focused on that mission. And this is going to be another thing where I think this one is interesting versus some of the other cases we've seen, even what I just talked about like typically Jesus had, some of the compassion that we see that he shows is for like the paralytic or the blind or people who are not well to do, right? But we have Zacchaeus here who people are looking at disparagingly because of his position and his wealth. Some of that is probably justified, but Jesus is still going to spend time with him, a person who, the Jews are looking at as on the same level as other kinds of horrible sinners. And Jesus is going to spend time with him, I think, which, goes to exactly what you were saying. Like he was here on that mission to do that. Yeah.
I've always admired the Lord's ability to invite himself over for dinner. Like, I can't do that. Like,
Yeah.
When's the last time any of us said, I will come to your house for dinner tonight?
Yeah.
We want to be invited, not invite ourselves.
Right.
But he could do it.
And then we expect if we did do that they would hurry down from a tree and receive us joyfully? Probably not. But he is, I guess, very, you've got some of that where like people want to see him, but I got to imagine he was disarming in how he conversed with people and that they felt like, he was a person just like the rest of us, which was part of the kind of one of the things of him being here and suffering like we do is so he's relatable. So I think that's a good point. And so, we see that Zacchaeus is going there. And so then when the people saw that this was happening, they complained, saying he's gone in to be the guest of a man who is a sinner. And so why would people have, we talked about this a little bit already, but like, why would people have been so upset about Jesus going into Zacchaeus's house? Yeah.
Well, they would think he's not worthy to have somebody of such prominence come over.
Yeah.
But what impresses me about Zacchaeus is Jesus doesn't even say a word. He's like, by the way, I'm going to fix myself by doing 1, 2, and 3 today.
Yeah.
And so it's just interesting how he just decided to change without Jesus even really saying anything other than I'm staying at your house.
Yeah.
A different twist on that verse. He might have felt that he was a just man. He might have been doing a good job. You could read it both ways.
Yeah.
One, he had a change of heart and he was going to fix it. Or, hey, I have been just.
Mm-hmm.
So it's hard to tell.
Yeah. When I was like looking at this, there were two different, like everybody was talking about how there were kind of two different ways that you could look at that almost as Zacchaeus, like justifying I've been doing this, or that like he kind of changes his ways. And so I think that's, either way that kind of plays out here, we either see that because Zacchaeus knows who Jesus is, he's excited to spend time with him, or, I guess because Zacchaeus is actually talking to Jesus, he decides to change his ways immediately. Like, those are two things, that are good for us to take into account. I think another thing here, if it is the case that like Zacchaeus was kind of shifting to go and give his possessions to the poor and do those things, that can be a good example for us, like when, or as we might have seen, when people come to know Jesus, like their life changes, or as we come to know Jesus or are reminded of that, we should change our behavior and turn away from things that we are doing. So that's important for us to keep in mind. Any other thought, like, I guess one of the other things that came to my mind as far as like people just also were naturally bad about like comparing ourselves to others, right? And so people might be also thinking like, why is Jesus going to spend time with Zacchaeus? Like, why is he not wanting to come, inviting himself into my house? Maybe even like fighting over like, why doesn't he want to spend time with me versus this man that we all look down on for these various reasons? Is like another thing that people could have been bitter about. We saw that, or we've seen that in some of what we studied and will continue to study, of how like, people will judge Jesus for who he's interacting with, who he's spending time with, what specifically that he's doing. And there's a variety of reasons. And, one of the other ones we've talked about before is like, depending on who's in the crowd, people thinking that like Jesus will be taking authority or power away from them because, of the prominence and like people looking forward to meeting him. And especially if the chief tax collector is excited to see him, then like, why isn't he showing us this kind of respect or whatever the case may be. So I think there's a lot of reasons that people in the crowd might complain about that.
It's also interesting that if Zacchaeus really understood who Jesus was, he didn't seem to be scared of him.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, if he, let's say, was doing these bad things that you said maybe he was doing as to why he's so rich and so blah, blah,
Yeah.
I would be pretty nervous if I was doing
Yeah.
bad things and then have Jesus say, I'm going to come to your house tonight.
Right.
I would be scared versus, hey, this is great. Let me give you a hug,
You wouldn't certainly offer to give back 4 times.
right. Like, so it's kind of interesting how he wasn't scared.
Yeah, and I think that's, there's ways that we can even look at that in our lives today, right? Like we could be so scared to come before Jesus or to pray about things like we were talking about earlier because of what we've done or maybe haven't gotten set straight in our lives. But ultimately, if we are truly willing to turn around or we've already repented of things like Jesus, that's what he's asked us to do. So we don't have to feel this guilt and this shame anymore. Like we can be excited about it. Do you think that's true?
Yeah, somebody on the live stream had a comment.
Okay.
Zacchaeus was also blind to what was right. He had to collect more than the allotted amount to live on. He collected more than he needed. Jesus healed his blindness to what was just.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought that was an interesting comment.
Yeah.
And then I would add, Rome was an occupying force. I mean, they were the enemy.
Mm-hmm.
The Jews did not want them there in their business. And Zacchaeus was working for the enemy.
Yeah.
He was betraying his own people.
Yeah, so people would have had, very strong feelings about Zacchaeus and what he was choosing to do. So I think that helps us understand some of what was going on here. And then in the, we already kind of hit on this too, but in verse 8, Zacchaeus talks about, behold, Lord, half of my possessions I am giving to the poor, and if I have extorted anything from anyone, I'm giving back 4 times as much. What we can hop over to Exodus 22:1 was the one reference I could find of Exodus 22 verse 1, where back then, as part of the law, if someone steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it or sells it, he shall pay 5 oxen for the ox and 4 sheep for the sheep. Just this concept, and we've seen this throughout, different things in the Old Testament too, of like having to repay for different things that people have done. So it's not unheard of for like the Jewish people to know, like, oh, it wouldn't just be restitution 1-to-1 for something that's gone on. We have, examples in the Old Testament of like restitution being more, and like there's, a lot of reasons for that, right? Like if you take money from somebody, that has the potential to earn them more money, that like, can cascade and different things like that. So definitely something to keep in mind there. And then in verses 9 and 10, we see Jesus say to him, today salvation has come to this house because he also is the son of Abraham. For the Son of Man has come to seek and to save that which was lost. Which, I kind of referred to as we were talking about, like, why did Jesus specifically say he must do this and come to Zacchaeus' house? But Jesus's mission was to bring salvation. It was to seek and save, to seek and save the lost. That's what he was doing at the time in different capacities. And so he was doing part of his mission. And kind of we see what became of that, of Zacchaeus making sure that he's treating people right and continuing to do what he should in the capacities he's in and the job that he's in. Yeah.
Much like in the world today, he was a chief tax collector, so he may not have done anything wrong himself, but he may also not have
kept track as well as he should have of the ones below him.
Yeah.
Just like the football coach who has abusive people below him
Mhm.
and ignores it. And then eventually it comes out and he gets fired and whatever.
Yeah.
So it's very possible, you can to be a really good leader, you need to also make sure that you are paying enough attention to the people below you that they're honest and doing the right thing.
You're ultimately responsible for what they're doing, and even we might find ourselves in positions like this today, where we work, where we might be a leader where we can stop some of this, or we might just be, if we're not a leader, you still have opportunity to like keep people honest and accountable around you. As far as that goes on, and like Baxter mentioned, there was a lot of like political stuff going on, and like Rome was in power and things, and so it would have been difficult to do. But I think this is a good example of, regardless of if he's able to change other people in every instance, he is going to do what he can do better in the position that he is in, or continue to do what he's supposed to do here. So I think that's a good thought for us to keep in mind as we go through our daily lives of like, sometimes there may be times where we can change other people around us and we make everything better, and sometimes we may just have to change our behavior, but like we need to do what we can. Yeah.
I see the difference between how the people looked at Zacchaeus and being judgmental,
Mm-hmm.
and Jesus saw him as someone who needed to be saved.
Yeah.
And that possibility was there.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes we talk to that crowd of people around and say, oh, it's really a bad piece of person, I'm not going to get married.
Yeah, I think
And
that's
you shouldn't either.
right. Yeah, like not even just I'm not going to spend my time with this person, but you should stay away from them. I think that's very easy for us even to do today in a lot of different ways of just like writing certain people off. And like we've seen, like it would be very like the Jewish people, it was easier for them to write off people who maybe didn't have as much money, or in this case had a lot of money, or different things like that with different life situations. And I think it's easy for us to do the same thing if we're find ourselves in a certain area or a certain place in life to just kind of discredit anybody else who doesn't think the same way we do or do things the same way we do. And I think we have to be very careful about that. Even if we have a reasonable, justifiable reason to disagree with another person, that person has a soul. We should show them love and compassion just like Jesus did, and try to kind of break those biases and barriers down when we're working with people. So good point. Any other thoughts before we move on to the last passage? Yeah.
If this doesn't really have anything to do with that, maybe it said, make haste and come down. And my grandfather used to say that all the time. He never said hurry. He always said, make haste, make haste.
Yeah.
I was just thinking, like, I love our country. Like, I appreciate being a citizen. It's not a perfect nation by any means. But even with that said, every time I deal with the IRS, it makes me nervous. And every time I get something in the mail from those people, my heart skips a beat. And, like I call in to ask a question, I get concerned, and I don't know. But I just think about it'd be so much worse with Zacchaeus and Rome and that whole political situation.
Right.
And the other thing, just briefly, just the emphasis here on like restitution.
Mhm.
It was not enough for Zacchaeus to say sorry and move on.
Yeah.
I mean, like if I steal your car, we got a problem,
Mhm.
and it can't be fixed by me just saying sorry.
Right.
If it's in my power to make a change like that, I got to do it.
Right. Yeah, and that's what true repentance is, when we like are changing from doing something, changing our life. We need to like turn completely away from something, and there may have been consequences to the actions that we performed before, and it's important that we try to make those as right as we possibly can and not make excuses for that.
And I'm just looking forward to explaining to Zacchaeus that the state of Illinois has figured out how to take money out of your wallet while you're sitting on it, while you're driving 65 miles an hour.
Yeah, well, we'll go on to the next passage, but no, that's a good. good thoughts there. Okay, well, I'm going to read Luke 10:25-37 real quick, and we'll try to discuss some quick points out of that. Luke chapter 10, verses 25-37. And behold, a certain lawyer stood up and tested him, saying, Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? And he said to him, What is written in the law? What is your reading of it? So he answered and said, You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And he said to him, You have answered rightly. Do this, and you will live. But he, wanting to justify himself, said to Jesus, And who is my neighbor? Then Jesus answered and said, A certain man went down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among thieves, who stripped him of his clothing, wounded him, and departed, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a certain priest came down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. Likewise, a Levite, when he arrived at the place, came and looked and passed by on the other side. But a certain Samaritan, as he journeyed, came where he was, and when he saw him, he had compassion. So he went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine, and he set him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. On the next day, when he departed, he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said to him, Take care of him, and whatever more you spend when I come again, I will repay you. So which of these 3 do you think was neighbor to him who fell among the thieves? And he said, He who showed mercy on him. Then Jesus said to him, Go and do likewise. So we see here this lawyer that's standing up. He's testing Jesus, asking things. So lawyers at this time were experts in the Mosaic law. We can see him, even as we go through this passage, kind of acting like we might expect a lawyer to today, of like picking out certain things and focusing on specific pieces. We see this back and forth that he has with Jesus, where he asks him what he should do to inherit eternal life, and then you have Jesus responding to him like, What's written in the law? What's your reading of it? Which I don't know if it, in my head, I think of it as a little snarky, because if this is your job to know this, like, what do you think? But anyway, we see that he answers rightly according to Jesus in verse 28, but then verse 29 he goes on and wants to justify himself, and this is where we can think of even like lawyers today who might pick things apart or whatever, trying to say, well, let me define who my neighbor is so I can say this is what I have to do specifically within these bounds to follow these commands. Like maybe if we think about like the distance they could travel on the Sabbath or different things, maybe he's thinking, if I can define that my neighbor has to be in this radius, or he has to be on the house to my left or the house to my right, then I can get out of doing the things that I'm required to do, as someone following the law, because I can define who my neighbor is very specifically. And we see that happen a lot from, the Pharisees and the different kind of like hedges that they put around the law and different things, and would bind people to, and things like that throughout the Old and the New Testament. And so, we see some of that here. And then Jesus ultimately answers with a parable, talking about, a man who was going from Jerusalem to Jericho, fell amongst thieves, had all this happen to him. And we see 3 different men come by. We have a priest and a Levite who see him pass on the other side. They don't want to stop to help. But a Samaritan comes and shows compassion and helps the man, and kind of goes above and beyond what we would even expect as far as what happens in 35 through 37, taking care of him, bandaging him, and like paying for the inn, as well as saying he'll pay for any other costs that come along. So I think it's important for us to take out a couple quick points here of from the parable. First of all, like, we can probably understand why, the priest and the Levite might have passed by on the other side. Like, we might be tempted to do that even ourselves today, right? Like, if this man got mugged in this position, one thing that's going through your mind is, if I stop to help him, what's going to happen to me? Is somebody going to come and attack me? What are they going to do to me? From what I read, the road between Jerusalem and Jericho, there were bandits on that road. And so like people would have been it would have been a reasonable thing to be concerned about this going on. And so we see the Levite and the priest pass by on the other side of the road. And part of the reason this parable is laid out this way is because the priest and the Levite would be the ones that the Jews would have expected to stop and help in this instance, whereas the Samaritan would be someone that the Jewish people look down on, right? And so what we're seeing here is just another example of what we talked about with Jesus, like highlighting the people that are able to do great things, or he's compassionate on, are the people who are often looked down on in society for various reasons. So we see that the Samaritan is the one that does good things. And ultimately, like when Jesus tells the lawyer, or the lawyer says that the Samaritan was the one who was writing the story, and Jesus says, go and do likewise. This is hopefully the lawyer is understanding. I don't need to be trying to define specifically who my neighbor is, not to take care of people. I need to be looking at everyone as my neighbor, people that I can help out, that I might see that are in dire need. And that's important for us to take away there. So sorry, I blitzed through that super fast. Any quick thoughts before we end class this morning? Yeah.
It's interesting to me that he just said a man, he didn't say he was a Samaritan or a Jew.
Yeah.
So, indicating it didn't really matter.
And I think that we need to try to keep that mentality, just with what we just talked about like who we choose to help out and things like that. It's important for us to try not to focus too much on the characteristics of the person themselves outside of just trying to help them with what might be going on, and not think too much about that. Any other thoughts? All right, if not, the clock has started, so thanks for a good class.